What's up, outliers? Welcome to Performance Bites, where bite sized insights into complex subjects and health performance. Today, we're going to take a dive into exercise selection, which I find is a very important thing because when talking about, strength or hypertrophy, power, endurance training, and stuff like that, that's only one component of creating a program, whether it's a coach creating a program or you creating a program for yourself. We need to be able to select the proper exercises to essentially help us get to our goals and help our body also keep muscular balance, and especially if we're having muscular imbalances. So, if you really kind of think about it, say you're doing strength training, power training, hypertrophy training 3 times a week and your workouts are going to consist of 6 to maybe 8 different movements, not including like your warm-ups and stuff, but just including like your core movements, which are going to be, your big body multi-joint movements, and then adding in your accessories, and then also like your core strength movements for your abdomen, your back, and stuff like that. So 6 to 8 of those. So then you multiply that by 3, right? So now you get 18 to 24 total exercises to work with. That is not a lot. So it's kind of tough sometimes to be like, okay, which ones should I use? Which ones shouldn't I use? Which ones are going to help me with this? How much do I need to do of that? As far as like a body part, if I'm doing shoulders to legs to anterior, posterior to upper body, lower body, there's so much that is going on there, but you only have 16 to 24 movements to select from. So when you're doing that, it gets pretty tough. And I'm going to do this to make a point because I think it's kind of fun to kind of look at how many different exercises exist and kind of the range of them, all the way from like regressions of like the standard to progressions from the standard. So we're just going to look at a squat. Starting with the squat, if we look at what is a squat, we could do it from a seated position and simply just stand up, sit to stand. That's technically a squat. If we want to keep with that, we can do it single leg. There's another version. If we want to keep with that sit to stand, we could add weight in a goblet hold. So now we're going from a seated position to a standing position, holding a goblet. And I'm starting at like the most regressed version. I've worked with plenty of people that are coming off the couch in their 60s and can't do a squat. So this is where we start. We start from a seated position. Then, we can pass that up and we can move away from going from the seated position. We can just go with a assisted body weight squat. So they're holding on to something. Now you're actually squatting down to a depth, call it parallel to the floor with your thighs. Okay, you master that. Now you can add in things like weight, or you could just go with no assistance as well. Kind of skip that one. No assistance first. So body weight squat. Now we go to a goblet squat. So we're holding the weight at the chest. Now we can change that up even more. We could hold the weight at our shoulders, which would be like a rack squat. We could go one side, like a waiter squat. And we could also have different tools, called a dumbbell to a kettlebell. We could use a landmine. So all of these different versions of a squat, and we haven't even got into the big ones yet, right? So I'm getting my point across. Barbell, we can go high bar, low bar, mid bar, front squat, Zercher, overhead. We could use the transformer bar and get all sorts of crazy. So there's a lot of different exercises is ultimately what I'm getting at, because I just took one and I think I added maybe, I'm not counting, but call it 15 options, 15 to 20 options for one exercise. Okay. So which one of those are you going to do for your squat? That's hard to select from. So that's when you have to start to understand that there's levels to all these different exercises with the amount of regressions that exist, but also the amount of progressions that exist. And that's not just using weight for progression. That's actually only one component of it. Is adding weight is obviously great for progressing, but you can also change the position of the weight, or you can change the tool that is being used. So with that being said, exercise selection starts to be a little bit tricky, but also super, super important for your overall training and program. So the way that I like to do it, and the way that I was taught to do it through the NSCA, is essentially we want to select our exercises and order our exercises based upon the demand on the nervous system over anything else. So let's say we're building a workout for our Monday. and our goal is to develop strength. Today's episode is sponsored by intake breathing. Now, intake breathing is a nasal strip that actually is a rigid piece of plastic compared to those floppy ones that have a piece of metal in them. This one comes with tabs that you put on your nose, and the strip itself is magnetic and it will pull and dilate your nasal passage, which obviously is going to increase nasal flow and also increase nitric oxide that gets into your blood and dilates the system, which obviously is going to help relax the system in the right setting, but also is really great for performance. So I use it a lot when I'm doing high intensity exercise so I can increase my nasal breathing, but I also use it for sleep so I can relax better. If you want to try it out, head over to intakebreathing.com/outlierathlete and use code outlierathlete for 15% off your order. So big movements that are more of our compound movements, multi-joint movements, going back to the squat, should occur earlier in the workout routine than say later. Because if you were to have done, a bunch of lower body work and you're fatigued, and then you go get underneath the barbell and you're about to do your back squats and you're tired, you're likely going to not have the same juice as you would if you would have hit that barbell back squat early in the routine. Now, this still goes for if you're doing a goblet squat, if you're doing any sort of kettlebell squats, whatever. We just want those big compound multi-joint movements to be earlier on in our routine because the demand that they put on our nervous system is going to be higher than, say, if you're doing seated leg extension, right? That's a single joint movement. It's a great single joint movement. There's still some variety to that, of course. You can do both legs or single leg. But, when we are trying to achieve an overall goal, we want to try and eliminate as much variance of factors as possible. So we start with that big movement, the big compound movement, and we could do that a couple different ways too, because if we wanted to add in a superset or a compound set, where a superset, we would follow our barbell back squat with something of a hamstring dominant or glute dominant movement to counter agonist, antagonist movements. So that would be our superset. Now, for compound setting, which is more so useful if you're doing like hypertrophy compared to if you're doing strength, but it still can play into strength. But if we're doing a compound set, we would be doing like barbell back squats into walking lunges, both more quad dominant movements, anterior part of the body being repped upon in different ways so that you're fatiguing the system of the quads a little bit more. So kind of depends on the goal. And then we move on from there, and then we would be doing our smaller movements and breaking that down. If we have big upper body movements in our routine, say it's a full body routine, we would still want those ones to also be earlier in the routine compared to later. So it would be good to knock out essentially the big lower body movements, the big upper body movements early on in your program or your routine of that day, and then following those up with more of the smaller joint movements or single joint movements, and then finishing with like core abdomen movements. That would be if you're working on strength. Now, if you're in a phase of strength and power where you want to develop some power, this changes stuff up a little bit as well. Or maybe you're doing jumping, agility drills, whatever it is. You'd want the agility and the power to exist before the strength in this situation. So if you're working on box jumps, you would want that earlier on. If you're working on any sort of cleans or jerks or snatches, whether that's with dumbbells, barbells, kettlebells, whatever, you would want those to be before your strength movements because the taxation on the nervous system, once again, is going to be much greater than if you do it later on and you're just opening up the door for potential mistakes with those quick, fast movements. So that's where it actually really gets really, really important is in that power and strength type training. I want to make sure those ones are a little bit sooner so that you can have the nervous system basically be at 100. And the way that I like to look at this and the way that I explain this to athletes and clients is your battery during a workout session, it starts at 100%, which for some people, it doesn't even start at 100%. They might be going into the gym with it at 70%. But you start with it at a certain point. And throughout the training session, that battery is getting knocked down a little bit, little bit, little bit, little bit. And like I said, this is through the nervous system. So this is through a system that we can't really feel as physically as we would like muscular fatigue or heart rate or stuff like that. It's kind of in the background. And that's a really important thing to remember too with rest periods is rest periods aren't always designed, at least in strength training, to accommodate, say, heart rate or breath rate or anything like that. They're more so based around your nervous system and how your nervous system needs to recover before you go back in, which is why when you're doing like a 3 by 10 at 60% of a 1 rep max, it's not super taxing because you're at 60% of your 1 rep max. Yeah, there's 10 repetition, but it should be fairly doable. So your rest period's anywhere from 60 seconds to 90 seconds, not very long. But when you get down into, say, do like a 4 by 3, so 4 sets of 3 repetition, and you're at 87% of your 1 rep max, 90% of your 1 rep max, your rest periods are going to start to extend more up into that 3 to 5 minute zone. And that is simply because the nervous system actually needs that amount of time to recover and recuperate so that you can go back in and do that high intensity work again. And this changes a little bit when you get into like cardiovascular training and stuff like that because we are tending to heart rate and breathing and stuff like that. It's a little bit different, but we're talking about strength routine. So that little tangent simply is just to make you understand how important the nervous system is and tending to that nervous system, especially with the order of operations and order of exercise selection. Okay. So we have one example day built out for our week. We pick those 6 to 8 movements. Spring has finally come. So you know what that means? It means I'm going to be getting outside and doing a lot more activity. It also means I'm going to be sweating a lot more, which is why I like to make sure that I get electrolytes daily, whether or not I am going super hard at the gym, running at the track, racing my dirt bike, whatever the case be. I like to make sure that I have electrolytes on deck, which is why I use Next Hydration, which I actually formulated. It has 800 milligrams of pink Himalayan sea salt and also 300 milligrams of potassium. So it keeps that nice ratio of the sodium potassium. But also, it's super light tasting, making sure that it tastes just like lemon water. So very palatable, also super refreshing on a hot day. If you want to try it out, head over to nexthydration.com and use my code OutlierAthlete for 10% off. If you're a very new person to the gym, maybe you're only going twice a week, and that's totally fine. But a good rule of thumb is we want to make sure that we're trying to hit a muscle group every 2 to 3 days. So if you're only going twice a week, that would set you up for a routine that's going to look like maybe Tuesday, Friday, because then you have Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and then you only have Wednesday, Thursday. So you're getting that 2 to 3 zone. And when we're trying to hit muscles every 2 to 3 days, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to do the same movements or do huge movements for that muscle each time. So, example would be, the first day we programmed in the barbell back squat, which is more quad dominant. So maybe on the Friday, we make sure that we include in a step up, a lunge, or something of the sort to just reactivate that muscle group again. It doesn't mean that you have to go squat again after 2 or 3 days. It just means that the quads need to be involved again in 2 to 3 days. And that is for basically developing strength. And also, if you're doing hypertrophy, it's so that you maintain muscular breakdown because 2 to 3 days you should be recovered. So it's to make sure that you're continuing that breakdown. This does change for athletes that are in season competition because we're not trying to break down muscle and we're also not trying to gain strength. We're trying to maintain it. So these rules kind of switch, but that's specific to a certain population, of course. So when we look at it that way and we got those 2 days, the way that I like to set it up for people would be, well, if I did my big compound movement for my anterior legs, the other day I'm going to do my big compound movement for my posterior legs, squat, deadlift, right? So that's just keeping that balance. We can look at it the same way for the upper body. If I do bench press, I'm going to do a heavy bent over row. If I do pull ups, I'm going to do overhead press, stuff like that. But like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of different exercises that can be selected from bilateral to unilateral movements, especially when it comes to upper body. Alternating movements is another thing that we can do for lower body and upper body to kind of change it up. So it's a lot to kind of pick from, which when I start working with a lot of people, sometimes they're like, I just don't know what to do. There's so much. What do I do? And that's my job to kind of go, well, this is where you want to go. This is what you want to achieve. So if we're trying to create a schedule, I'm going to try and make sure that no stone gets unturned, but at the same time, we're not just turning over the same stones over and over and over again. And the way that I like to explain it to some of my motocross athletes using a moto analogy, essentially, which is universal, you'll understand it, is when you got a wheel and you have your hub in the middle and you have spokes. So, bicycle tire, this works too. Okay, you got your hub, you got your spokes, you got your wheel. Ideally speaking, all of those spokes would have the same amount of tension on them to create a perfect 360 degrees of pull on the wheel to keep that hub centered. Now, during exercise, obviously, if you're doing a anterior movement compared to doing a posterior movement, upper body movement compared to a lower body movement, these are different parts essentially of our wheel and hub system with the spokes. So we're tightening one spoke over here, which means it's going to pull one spoke here, which now your hub is going to be slightly off center. And so the idea is we want to basically run around to the other side, tighten up that other spoke so that the hub comes back center in our next workout routine. And the idea of this is we're covering the full 360 design of the hub and spoke and wheel so that that hub stays centered as possible. And you can look at this the same way with your joint. If I'm talking about my shoulder, I have different muscles that do different things. Some are of the anterior front side, some are the posterior, some are on top, some are on bottom. And they all are kind of pulling in different directions, right? So if I over dominate my pec muscle or my bicep muscle on my anterior side of my shoulder, it's going to pull that glenoid joint more forward, right? So to counter that for muscular balance, I would go around to the backside. I would do some pulling exercises, rotator cuff exercises to essentially build up strength in the posterior side of my shoulder so that the center of the joint doesn't sit forward and or backwards. But I'm going to say forward because it's very uncommon that uh, somebody has too far backwards shoulder joint positioning. Usually it's poor posture sitting forward. So that's the wheel and hub analogy, but put to the body. So that's muscular imbalance. And that's another thing with exercise selection is we need to make sure that if you're selecting exercises, you're trying to maintain that balance. And when I say this, I'm not just talking about the general public and I'm not just talking about professional athletes. This is important for the human body in general. We want to try to maintain as much balance to keep joints happy. Because whether you're a weekend warrior and you're going to go up to the mountain, go snowboarding, you're going to go mountain biking, or you're a professional athlete that is going to swing a bat, you're a professional athlete that's going to throw a ball, take hits, race a dirt bike, whatever it is, the body is set up anatomically to perform a certain way. And when our muscles are imbalanced, we are creating more drag, more resistance, essentially. And that's my favorite thing to kind of bring to people is when you correct muscular imbalances, sometimes things become easier, not simply because you're becoming stronger, but simply because you are taking away the resistance of your own body. So, an example of that would be, I'll go back to the shoulders and the pecs and the biceps. Really, really tight up front. So your shoulders are rounded forward, your pecs are super tight because you do a ton of push-ups, you do a ton of bicep curls or chin-ups or whatever, but you don't do much pulling posterior exercises to develop better posture and also to suck your shoulders back. Now, if I ask you even just to go into a better posture of your shoulders back and your shoulder blades set, that's already hard, right? So what if I ask you to also do that with a lot of weight? Now you have two forms of resistance. You have the weight resistance and you also have your own muscular resistance. So this is something that maybe gets a little bit advanced, but I think it's important to understand that's why muscular balance is super important and why muscular imbalances can actually cause overuse injuries. Because back to the wheel and hub, if we got our wheel and hub and the hub isn't sitting centered, that wheel will still spin, right? Your locomotive vehicle of a dirt bike or a bicycle or unicycle, whatever it is still going to function, but it's going to break down eventually. Something's going to break. It's probably going to be one of those spokes. And one of those spokes in the analogy is one of your muscles. And that hub is now going to have an issue, and that's going to be your joint. So when we look at it that way, it's like, oh, shoot, now it makes a lot of sense why if I have poor posture and my shoulders are forward because I'm doing a lot of anterior exercises, or I'm just sitting with shitty posture throughout the day because I'm at the computer or whatever it is, it makes sense why when I go into the gym and I try and do an overhead press or any overhead exercises, my shoulder just kills me, right? So that's the sort of stuff that once you can start to recognize these things makes a lot of sense, which I know this is about exercise selection, but exercise selection is about muscular balance and performance. So, like I said, there's so many different exercises that exist out there, but it's really kind of a breakdown to understand which ones are going to be best. And that's where working with a coach, I really think is super useful, even if it's just to expand your own library of exercises. Because my library is huge. I mean, you can name one exercise, I'll give you 20 to 30 different versions of that exercises, and I'll order them from least to greatest degree of difficulty, essentially. And that's experience, but at the same time, it's a sign of a good coach that knows where to put somebody in and where to progress them from rather than just being like, I don't know, just like go do the barbell. Uh, you did 95 pounds last week, so we'll do 100 pounds this week and we'll just go until you can't do it anymore. Then lo and behold, muscular imbalance occurs, the knee hurts, the lower back hurts, whatever the case. And you're going, well, like, I came in here because I wanted to get fit and be stronger on my mountain bike, and now my knee hurts, and now I can't mountain bike at all. Sound familiar? It's probably a story that you've heard or experienced in your own life, unfortunately. So I can't give you all the tools and everything to do it because every individual is going to be different. I can only give you a broad understanding of how important exercise selection is, how important it is for muscular balance, how important it is for your overall performance and health and longevity. So if you want to dive deeper into that, please reach out to me, comment on the video, comment on the podcast. I'll be happy to help you out and give some suggestions. Obviously, I'm not going to give you just like a free program just for funsies. But if you want to work with me personally, super easy. Just go to my website, which is outlierathlete.com. Reach out to me. More than happy to help and get something set up so that you don't have to deal with those issues and you can be the best version of yourself. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.